Let's go ahead and analyze adaptations and responses to the environment through an owl. So the first thing we'll do is we'll look at all the physical characteristics that it has, and we'll kind of see how this allows it to survive in its given environment. So we'll start with this little guy down here, and one thing that we notice when we look at him, of course, are those big eyes. So they have large front-facing eyes, which is going to allow them to be more efficient predators, give them a good sense of depth perception because they're going to be swooping down on prey from the air. Second, if we check out its feet down here, we're going to notice that it has some pretty intense talons going on, and those talons have some incredible gripping strength. So they're able to grab onto things that they're hunting and hold on very tight before they go to eat their prey. Let's also talk about the way owls turn their heads. If you've ever seen an owl turn its head, it's quite impressive. It can almost turn its head around between 270 and 360 degrees. So it has a great deal of scanning capability when it's looking around for prey to hunt. Another thing about when it's hunting that makes it so effective is the fact that it's a silent predator. That when it swoops through the air, one thing that happens are these owls have serrated edges on the tips of their feathers. And what that does allows them to fly silently through the air as they dive bomb and capture their prey. So they're almost like the stealth bomber of the nocturnal world. Now, the last thing we'll mention is, in terms of physical characteristics, is this. You can barely even see there's an owl. If you were in the forest and you walked by this, you might not even know that there was an owl sitting there looking at you. So we can also say they are camouflaged for their environment that they've adapted to. So all of these physical characteristics lead to this particular bird being able to survive, reproduce, and continue its way of life. Now, what about the other half, the behavioral stuff? Well, let's start with what owls do. Well, if you ask a child what does an owl do, and they'll usually hoot. Well, that's right. They hoot, they screech, they click, they purr, they even do what's called chittering. Now, what's all that for? Why do they do that? Well, these calls are purely behavioral. At least 15 owl calls are known, and their purposes are very different from each other. One is defensive posturing, a specific call for that, saying, hey, get out of my territory. There's preening, there's wing clapping, and food offering. Now, some of these are territorial things, and some of these are to woo female owls and to possibly reproduce with them. So let's take a look at another behavioral thing real quick before we move on. Look at that. Okay, that is an owl that doesn't want you close by. So it's doing its defensive posture. It might make some sounds associated with, hey, you're coming too close, this area is mine, and back off. So we can see these owls are magnificent in terms of all of these physical adaptations and behavioral adaptations that they show. The third thing that living things do is they reproduce. Now, living things have two ways of doing that, sexually and asexually. Now, with sexual reproduction, what we see happening is that there is an egg, and an egg is a female sex cell, and then we have a sperm, which is a male sex cell. And what happens is the sperm will find its way into the egg, and their genetic contents will combine together to form a new organism. With asexual reproduction, what we have typically is an organism growing to a certain size and then splitting. So asexual reproduction basically makes clone organisms. So if this is an amoeba right here, when it gets to a certain size, it's going to split into two, what we call daughter amoeba, and they are identical to the first one. They're going to do the same things themselves. They're going to grow to a certain size and split. Now, often that's referred to as something called binary fission. And binary fission is how we say that bacteria go ahead and reproduce themselves. But there's also another possibility with asexual reproduction called budding. And that's when a particular part of an organism starts growing like a side shoot or a side part to it, which is identical to the original organism. And eventually it buds off and either floats away or moves away in some manner and starts its own life somewhere else away from its parent. But it too is also a clone. The fourth characteristic of life is that living things grow and develop. So here we have an animal and we have a plant. And you can see that both of them start as a fertilized egg, which means that a sperm got inside an egg, and this is now cell 1 of the new organism. We can even say that for the plant too. In this case, the sperm contents, the genetic content, got inside the egg, and now it's fertilized. So in every case, we go from 1 cell to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to 16. It keeps doubling. So in this case here with the animal, you can see first it forms a ball of cells through cell division. Eventually that becomes hollow. Over time, you see part of it kind of folding inward. After a bit more development, we then have what's called a larval stage of development. And over time, when all is complete, we'll have an adult sea star as a result. Down here, we have a zygote, which is the first cell of the plant, and over time 2 cells, over time 8 cells. We then see this stalk with a ball on the top. We then see this heart shape, which is just more and more cells being divided and now existing there. We see seed leaves develop, and over time we eventually get a mature plant. Now, does everything grow and change this much? No. Some very simple organisms don't do very much growing and very much developing, but there is a little bit that occurs throughout their lifetime. For example, this right here is an algae, and this algae will be born basically this way, and it will go through a little bit of growth and a little bit of change in the interior, but for the most part, it will remain relatively the same size. So even if there's not a whole bunch of growth, development will happen. The fifth characteristic of life is acquisition of energy and utilization of that energy. And what we're going to start with is this picture right here. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to draw a sun in the corner, because ultimately the sun is going to provide all of the earth, all of the biosphere with the initial energy that gets this process rolling. So what we have happen first is we have solar energy come down from the sun. And what's going to happen with this solar energy is the plant is then going to convert it into chemical energy. So this tree here is chemical in terms of the energy that it possesses, as well as the grass here as well is also going to be chemical. Now, what's going to happen is that this particular animal here, this cow, is going to be eating the grass. And by doing that, it's going to be changing this chemical energy here into a different form of energy that its body can use, which will eventually be able to convert it into mechanical energy. So by the animal breaking down the nutrients that are found in grass and in plant matter, what's going to happen? It's acquiring energy, and it's going to utilize it. It's going to change it from this form of broken down grass into another molecule, which we'll see in a second, and then we'll be able to turn that into mechanical energy for its muscle cells. So the chemistry behind all these conversions, part of it is right here. And I know this looks very scary and it looks complicated. And in its own way, it is. There's no hiding that fact. But what are some things that we can nail down this early in a biology class? Well, the first thing we can do is say, okay, here's glucose. Glucose is a very simple sugar, and it's in all kinds of plant matter. And what's going to happen is this glucose is going to begin the process within an animal by being broken down and being turned into our energy currency of living things called ATP. Now, what's going to happen here over time is that not only will it break down, but it's going to go through a number of transformations and chemical cascades on its way to becoming that ATP. And this is called cellular respiration. And we'll have an entire lecture dedicated to that. And over time, it produces some waste products like carbon dioxide and water. But what eventually happens in the end, after it goes through all these steps, it's going to remove some electrons, which are little tiny charged particles, and it's going to send them down a particular pathway. And as they go down this pathway, they are harnessed, just like water behind a dam, to produce energy. And our chemical energy, again, is in the form of something called ATP, which has the name adenosine triphosphate. So there's a little bit of chemistry that you're going to have to pick up along the way in biology, but that's all part of it. The last thing that living things do is they maintain homeostasis. Now, we mentioned this word when we were talking about responding to the environment and adapting because it's something that all living things do, and it's a very short-term basis. We have to maintain a steady state within ourselves, and we call that homeostasis. So let's take a closer look. Homeostasis occurs in 4 major steps within living things. The first thing we have to understand is that we have things that are variable that affect us. Factors in our body that can be modified by some kind of effector, but that really is complicated sounding. Let's simplify this a little bit. You have various parts of your body that are affected by both internal changes and external changes. So there's some variation that occurs. For example, if you weren't dressed properly and you walked out on a cold day, the temperature outside is very cold and the temperature within you is variable. So that cold will start affecting you as your temperature will drop. Over time, a receptor will take in that sensory information and say, hey body, I'm getting cold. The next thing that's going to happen is the receptor will send a message to what's called a control center, which determines the set point and regulates the body's response. And then the last thing that happens is it will send a message to an effector that carries out the body's response and brings this particular out of whack system back to normal. And there, a different variable may affect it, and you might have to do the whole thing around again. So let's take a look at that in terms of temperature. So when temp goes down, we then have to perceive that with our body. And we do that with our skin's temperature receptors. So underneath the surface of your skin, you have little tiny nerves that go ahead and they sense the temperature, the ambient temperature outside of you, the organism. Then a message is sent to your control center, which is going to be a little structure in your brain called the hypothalamus. It's kind of like the thermostat of your body. An outgoing message will then come from your hypothalamus to the rest of your body, your effectors, which are your muscles. And in the case here, your muscles will start to move very quickly. You'll start shaking, your teeth will start chattering, and that's done to generate heat, which is going to bring your body temp back to normal. So that is a homeostatic mechanism. It takes something that has gone out of balance back to balance through a number of actions. Now, for something to be considered an organism, for something to be considered alive, it must possess these 6 characteristics. These are the characteristics of life. Now, we still have a lot of biology to learn, but this is a good starting point. So I will see you in the next lecture.